Hey everyone, I'm Matt Freedman, Matt F. the Oracle. Welcome to the third episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. This week we're going to talk about winning Contrarian tournament strategies. Let's get started. Our guest for the week is Dr. Nick Giffen on Twitter at Rotodoc. He's an editor and podcaster at Rotoviz, a PhD in mathematics, and the winner of several DraftKings guaranteed prize pools. In fact, just this last weekend, he took down the two biggest GPPs for the first NASCAR slate of the season. Nick, considering that you just won a lot of money, I probably don't need to ask you this, but how's it going?
Well, it was quite the weekend. NASCAR's back, which, as you know, is my sport, especially living in North Carolina, which is NASCAR country. And to take down the first GPPs of the season was a pretty exciting event. It was at Daytona, which is a completely just mayhem, hectic track. So definitely a lot of luck involved. But I think, kind of the theme of the show is contrarian strategies. You got to build a lineup to get yourself in position to take advantage of that luck. So it was really just about good roster construction and a lot of celebration afterward.
Awesome. It's good to have you on the show. And then making their roundtable debut, we have editor of FantasyLabs and host of the FantasyLabs podcast, Bryan Mears at Bryan Mears. And also next to him on the right side of your screen and sporting a hoodie that makes him look even more muscular than he actually is, we have boss man Jonathan Bales at Bales Football. Of course, he's the co-founder of FantasyLabs, the founder of Roto Academy, and a lot of other things. Bros, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man.
And
it's fun to be on.
Yeah, also right there next to them, just sort of like in the corner of the screen, trying not to be noticed, we have Justin Phan at JFan, of course, the man behind the Phan model and the brain behind the projections for our NBA models. Justin, how's it going?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I have to say, it's a lot of man on that screen right there, and it's a nice touch with the fire in the background. Let's just go ahead and jump into it. At this point, it is almost cliche to say that if you want to do well in a GPP, then you need to have a contrarian approach. Contrarianism is now so in vogue that the question arises of what it even means to be a contrarian when everyone else is trying to do what you are doing. So we're going to explore that question and other questions like that in the show. Nick, let's start with you. In your mind, what does it mean to be a contrarian?
Well, for me, I guess, the definition of contrarian is kind of going against the grain or against public opinion. But for me, it's not really about that. It's really about a mindset. So as a, kind of a math and numbers guy, statistician, I used to actually always just, optimize my lineup and find the optimal projections and everything like that. And that's great and all, but that really leads to a great cash game lineup. If you have kind of the optimal lineup where everything that's supposed to happen does happen, and over the course of large numbers or a large enough slate of games, it'll tend to work out for you. So I always had that cash game mindset, and it was really about changing the mindset. And what actually did it for me was actually listening to Bales over here on a podcast. I think it was with Pat Mayo on the Pat Mayo Hour, and I think he was just talking about contrarian strategies, and it really just changed my mindset. And so I just started trying to embrace this new mindset. And the first thing I had to do was I actually had to learn to increase my risk tolerance. So I'd always kind of, not wanting to take too many chances, too many risks, and not necessarily with a bankroll, but just in terms of like, hey, I'm going to enter a lineup in and I'm going to use some guys that, I feel strongly about, but have a much higher risk to reward ratio. So there's a much better chance of me not cashing than in a cash game format, for example. So I had to learn to increase my risk tolerance and just to kind of begin to change that mindset. And another thing about that mindset is being contrarian to me doesn't mean just being different to be different. It means, forming strong beliefs about certain players or certain, ways of doing things and then taking advantage of it when, the public isn't doing that. So how can I take advantage of something if, what is supposed to happen doesn't actually happen? So kind of embrace the chaos, as I like to say. A good example of embracing the chaos for me, not even in DFS, but in week 2 of the NFL season, I was playing in an eliminator pool. So, if you pick the incorrect winner, you're out. So it was week 2, and there were 3 heavy favorites. The Saints were heavy favorites over the Buccaneers, Ravens over Raiders, Dolphins over Jaguars, and all 3 of them lost. And I ended up picking the Bengals as a smaller favorite over the Chargers. It wiped out like 80% of the pool in week 2, and I was able to survive, further along. So it's just finding, areas where if things go awry, how can you take advantage of that? So for me, it's just, again, it's a mindset. I'm constantly thinking, putting in tons of time researching, analyzing trends, not just trends for, what's likely to happen, but what is the possible upside. I create models. One of the things I really like to do is I follow social media. What is the big stories of the week? Who is everybody talking about? Because, then you can kind of gauge ownership that way. And most importantly for me, it's really thinking about game theory and storylines. I really am a kind of a storyline player. So I like to, look and see, hey, if the game goes this way, who can probably benefit from it? And, especially if it's a possible outcome, it may not be a probable outcome, but if it's a possible outcome, how does that storyline go into effect? So that's kind of what it means to me to be a contrarian. It's really just all about that mindset and embracing that mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought that was a good point from Nick about just a shift in mindset, because the way that you approach cash games is so much different. It's just a completely different philosophy. You're always looking for the biggest possible edge that you can find, but the biggest edge in cash games is mostly value driven, whereas in tournaments it is, and if you're being a contrarian player in tournaments, it really is about judging public psychology and then trying to leverage that into an advantage. So it is a completely different way of thinking.
Bryan, a question here. Do you think that contrarianism is perhaps overemphasized when people are talking about tournaments? Like, for instance, what's wrong with just building a lineup that you think has a lot of potential without worrying too much about ownership percentage?
Well, I think nowadays most people have the same information. There's a variety of sites, FantasyLabs included, where you can see a fan model, you can see all the best plays. So a lot of people are getting the same information, which is good for a cash game model because that increases your safety and minimizes your risk in a cash game. But contrarianism really is just, honestly, our decisions and how contrarian we are in a contest is really dictated by the site and the contest that they offer. So if the only thing in DFS that was offered was a 50-50, if that was the only contest that you could play, then contrarianism wouldn't be a thing in DFS. There would just be no reason to be contrarian. But they have GPPs, and so kind of just because the prize pool is smaller and it is more rewarding to be in the top 20% as the top 50%. That means you have to be a little more contrarian. And then you also have like a qualifier where you only have only the first place out of 1,000 people makes any money, or it gets a ticket into a live event or anything like that. And in that setting, you have to be really, really contrarian. So really how contrarian you are is really just dependent upon the contest that you're in. So I don't think it's really overrated. I guess it could be depending on what contest you're in, but I would say if you're in a qualifier, then no, it's not really. It might be even underrated because you have to be really contrarian because you have to be in the first place or bust, really.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The payout structure dictates how contrarian you should be in a tournament. And being contrarian doesn't mean, there's not one specific player, one specific team that's always contrarian. It's just trying to exploit inefficiencies in the way other people think. So if public psychology changes, then something that might be chalky right now could be contrarian next year. It's something that is always sort of shifting.
Jonathan, can you talk about that a little bit more? Are there times, or when are the times when you think it makes sense to be, a little counter-contrarian, to go against the contrarian crowd in a GPP and to have some lineups that are a little bit maybe too chalky?
Yeah, I think it really does depends on the sport. It depends on the slate. The sport is really big. So if you're an NBA, it's more difficult to be contrarian because the game is more predictable night to night. So when Westbrook is in a great matchup or something, he's going to hit what we think he's going to hit maybe 80% of the time, whereas Mike Trout in a great matchup might hit that level of production 40% of the time. And so the predictability of the sport, I think, is maybe the most important thing in determining how contrarian you should be. And then I also think the payout structure, like we talked about, obviously, and then the types of players who are going to be in it. So we know that in a 1K, we're going to have sharper players. They're probably going to be a bit chalkier, where there might be more incentive to be contrarian versus a $3 or a millionaire maker, where you have just sort of everyone who's on DraftKings, for example, in there. It probably makes more sense to be chalkier in that situation.
So question. I think it is sport specific. So if we have a situation where, let's say Mike Trout is minimum price for just a single night, you would still potentially fade him in a tournament because the sample size of baseball, you go 0-4, so they're still worth in fading him. Whereas if Steph Curry was minimum price, there's no ever situation where you would fade him. So it really is sport specific, and that it's not sport specific, it's predictability specific. And NBA just happens to be more predictable than MLB on a night-to-night basis.
That's a good point, because in MLB, pitchers and batters completely different. So pitchers are way more predictable night to night, just a larger sample size, and so it's probably less sharp to go against the grain on pitchers. And easier and probably more profitable long term to be contrarian on stacks or batters.
Right. So there would be correlation in terms of the number of times a player has an opportunity to produce points. Essentially, that it seems like that's what you guys are saying.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. Nick, do you have any thoughts? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Similar
idea in NFL too, where you have quarterbacks are more difficult to obvious value. Quarterbacks are more difficult to fade than a tight end or a wide receiver, just because their production is more volatile.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with that. I mean, in the stick and ball sports especially, it's a lot of it comes down to how much opportunity you have. And in baseball, a batter only has anywhere from 3 to 5 usually plate attempts per game. There's occasional game he gets 6 or more, but that's a very finite opportunity. And if you go 0 for 3 or you go 5 for 5, that's a completely different outcome. And then, a sport like NFL, if the running back gets 20 touches, plus or minus a little bit, it's a much smaller variation on the total number of opportunity than, 3 hits to 4 hits, for example. So it really depends on the sport. Basketball is much more predictable. So you can be, I think, a little less contrarian there. And actually an example where, kind of going counter contrarian, in other words, being more chalky helped out. Just the other day, I was playing a 4-game NBA slate, and it was announced Greg Monroe is going to be on the bench instead of starting. And I was using all of my tools. I was using the FantasyLabs. I was using the plus minus, the bargain rating, and everything like that. Greg Monroe was like just the chalkiest play for me. And then all of a sudden they announced he was going to be on the bench, coming off the bench. And most of the people in that tournament ended up, pivoting off of Monroe to somebody else. I left him in there because I said, hey, it's likely he'll still see a good chunk of his minutes. If he drops from 31 to 28 minutes, that's still pretty good. His matchup's fantastic. The pace is fantastic. And he'll actually be coming in with the second string against Boston's second stringers. Maybe it's Kelly Olynyk or Tyler Zeller instead of Sullinger. And all of a sudden he's got an actually even better matchup. And Monroe actually ended up having like the highest score of the slate or something. So, it really just comes down to a mindset, just being one step ahead of everybody else. I just left the chalk play in because he got benched and suddenly he wasn't the chalk play anymore. So just keep thinking about game theory, keep thinking about the possibilities. And that's kind of how I like to approach things.
Nick, let's talk a little bit about some specific strategies. So most people, when they build lineups, they try to use as much of the salary cap as possible, and that can actually inhibit their ability to create contrarian lineups. It reduces the number of total lineup options they can create. How do you approach the salary cap in GPPs?
Yeah, I think just like contrarian strategy in general, it depends on the sport, the slate, the situation. So, for example, NFL, if you're in a big slate, you probably will need to be closer to the salary cap maximum than, for example, a 2-game slate or a 4-game slate. simply because there's just more sample size. There's more players. So overall, it's more likely that, good players will go off and you'll need to get them in your lineups. You still want to find value, but overall, I think you'll probably need to be a little bit closer to the cap. In small slates, I don't think you necessarily need to fill all the way up to the salary cap sometimes, because it's in 2-game slates, for example, it's about finding those players who will go off. So there's fewer games. So if in a 2-game slate, if one game deviates from the Vegas, expectation, that has a much bigger impact in a 2 or a 4-game slate than it does in a 16-game NFL slate, for example. So we'll go to an example. Owen Daniels in the AFC Championship game had a multi-touchdown game, and if you rostered him and Peyton Manning, for example, you probably did pretty well. So they didn't even take up a whole bunch of salary cap. So it's about storylines, I think, in those smaller slates. Actually, Matt, I was reading an article of yours, one of your first articles at FantasyLabs. You actually talked about this exact slate, the conference championship slate, where it was New England, Denver, and Arizona and Panthers. And you didn't worry about the salary cap. You just talked about a couple storylines, how maybe if Peyton Manning had a good day, who could benefit from it? If Arizona had a good day, who could benefit from it? And then you filled out a nice roster without even worrying about the cap, and your roster came in well under the cap. So, I think in shorter slates, it's a little bit easier to kind of not worry about the cap, and it almost is an advantage, because the mindset of a lot of the general public is like, oh, I have $5,000 left I can spend. I'm going to try to find a guy as close to $5,000 as I can, when that's not necessarily the case. In NBA, I think, projections and deviation from the norm is a little bit less. So it's probably lends itself more to, filling up your salary, finding a good 3K guy who's, going to get extra minutes because of an injury, and then, filling out the rest of your lineup with some expensive players, and, kind of maximizing your upside there. But it's completely situational dependent. So, one other thing, I guess, that kind of drives it is how chaotic will it be? How predictable will it be? For me, for NASCAR, for example, it's really far less predictable than the NBA. So in certain instances, you can get away with being well below the salary cap. I was well below the salary cap in the GPP I just won this past weekend. So you don't have to fill up all the way to the cap, but it really depends on the situation. But if there's a time you can get away from it, it just helps you be more unique, because most people are looking to fill up the cap as just a general mindset.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the opportunity cost and how valuable leaving salary cap on the table is to you in terms of actually creating a unique lineup. So a good example is PGA. It's difficult in the Millie Maker, for example, to create a unique lineup if you fill up the cap. It's just very, very challenging. And I saw some stats that I think the optimal amount of cap to spend on DraftKings is like 49.5 in the Millie Maker, just because once you start filling it up, everyone else is doing that, and you're going to end up chopping the pot a lot. And so it's just not as plus EV to spend all that cap. And that's really related a lot to the lineup overlap and then the predictability of the sport. PGA is more volatile than NBA, for example, where there's a greater opportunity cost because of that predictability in not filling up the cap.
Bryan, here's a question. What about targeting players in matchups with low implied point totals? So in general, the idea is that you want players who are going to be in high-scoring games. Is there actually an advantage to going away from high-scoring contests?
Yeah, of course. I mean, because there's other factors that go into it. I mean, first off, Vegas isn't perfect. So, I mean, you could I think I saw a stat in NFL. There's just a very low correlation between the implied runs or the implied score and the actual score. So in just a volatile sport like that, yeah, I mean, just kind of being off of what everyone else is on. If they're on a really high scoring game, that's a good way to be contrarian. In NBA, I think you can do that too, because one factor that you're not thinking about is that these players are priced accordingly. So players that are in low-paced games and score less in general are going to be lower priced anyways, and the higher-priced guys are going to be like Steph Curry and Draymond Green, who play in super high-paced games that are like 130 or 230 total or whatever. So there's other factors that go into it, which I think you could use a plus-minus statistic or something like that. to kind of really see the true value as opposed to just how they compare to the Vegas implied score or whatever you want to say. But yeah, I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of ways to be contrarian. I think the important thing to remember in being contrarian is that your goal is to create a contrarian lineup, your goal is to create a unique lineup that has a lot of upside. And you can do that in a variety of ways. So you can target low Vegas implied games. You can do it by taking guys in bad matchups. You can do it by stacking in the NBA, which is supposedly not supposed to be a great idea. And so that's maybe a way that you could be a little chalky, but you still get a unique lineup. For example, you could roster, like if Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook and the Thunder in general in a really good matchup, a lot of people are going to pick one or the other because the mindset is that one of them is going to go off and you have to choose which one it is. So you'll split half your lineups and go 50% Kevin Durant, 50% Russell Westbrook, and hopefully the rest of your lineup fills out. But a good contrarian lineup is to maybe stack both of them, which may be a little less optimal, but they're going to be less owned. So if they're 50% owned in the field separately, they're probably only going to be maybe 10 to 12% owned together. So you can get a unique lineup while still being kind of chalky. And there's a lot of ways to be contrarian, but again, the goal is to be unique. You don't have to do that by taking bad players or, when we think contrarianism and we talk about it, we think it's taking a bad player or a low-owned player or something, when that's not really the goal. The goal is to create a unique lineup, and you can do that in a variety of ways.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And related to that is the idea of game stacking. So stacking, you can be sort of chalky in stacking a game. Maybe in MLB, you're using on DraftKings like a 4-3-1 combination where you're targeting certain bats on both the away team and the Rockies at home when they're at Coors. So just different ways like that where you can have some guys who are high ownership and still have a unique lineup. And maybe another example would be instead of trying to maybe create a lineup that has a bunch of guys who are like kind of high owned, maybe kind of good value, I think it's easier to just go with the chalk, get chalk in your lineup, and then find one or two players who are going to be super low owned who you really like. And I think just in terms of probabilities, that's going to be a more profitable strategy that still allows you to get exposure to the chalk, so you're probably not taking on as much risk as well, but it's still a contrarian strategy.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, let's kind of follow up on this. What about tough matchups? Is there an advantage, do you think, to targeting players who could be low-owned on account of facing a strong opponent? Or I guess phrased differently, how do you take matchups into account when you are looking to be contrarian?
Yeah, it depends on the sport, depends on the position. One of my favorite things to do is take high-priced players, take studs in bad matchups, pretty much in every sport, because those guys like a Megatron or a Mike Trout facing a decent righty or something. Those guys can go off against anybody. So that's one of my favorite things to do. Similarly, taking those studs when they're maybe a little bit overpriced, but obviously overpriced. So maybe Mike Trout should be $5K and he's $5,500. So you're eating that $500 of salary, but you might get him at a quarter of the ownership or something like that. So yeah, mainly when I'm more matchup dependent, I guess, on cheaper players or inferior players, and then with those studs, I care less about the matchup.
And I think how matchup dependent you are is, again, this is just, we talked about this in the very first question, is what's the definition of being contrarian? It's being away from the public. So if there ever comes a time where people pick up on that strategy and really don't care about matchups, then it's really not in your best interest to target those guys because there's no value to being contrarian in that way. So I think there is a lot of value in what Bale said in taking a Mike Trout against a good righty or whatever bad matchup you think that is going to lower the ownership of a guy. But the important thing is that it lowers the ownership of the guy. If it doesn't do that, then it's not really being contrarian. So I think it's a good strategy now, but the important thing is to always keep on thinking, what is the public doing and what can I do to get away from that?
Similar idea a few years ago, it was pretty much optimal in every instance to completely stack a team in baseball. And now because everybody knows that, it depends on the offense. If you're going to have a low-owned stack, it probably makes sense to stack the entire offense. But there's probably more value in using a cash lineup in baseball now than there's ever been. And so, yeah, it's a landscape that's always sort of shifting based on what people are doing.
And there's probably value in stacking in a cash lineup, right? Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a different idea, but the correlations in baseball, which is related to this discussion on being contrarian, is super important. Yeah, of course. And in baseball, because of those correlations, and people are aware of those correlations, it creates much greater lineup overlap. So when you stack the Rockies at home, for example, there might be six pieces of the puzzle that everyone has the same. And so there's just more incentive to be contrarian in baseball, even above the unpredictability of the sport because of that lineup overlap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about stacking, a really standard way for people to try to maximize points. But as you mentioned, there might be ways in which, or times rather, in which you don't want to stack, or maybe ways in which you want to stack, but to try to do so in a contrarian manner. Nick, what do you think are the ways in which people can stack yet still be contrarian?
Yeah, well, I think Bryan just mentioned one of it, the Westbrook and Durant example. Playing them together rather than an either or is one way to be contrarian. And I actually find myself facing that situation a lot. And, that's just one way. Instead of doing the either or, if you play them together rather than 50% and 50%, again, now all of a sudden, instead of the expectation would be 25% together, actually they're only 10% together because people tend to be picking one or the other. That's a good way. Another good way is to just look for maybe kind of the alternative option in a stack. So an example I like to give would be in the NFL. You've got, the Houston Texans and their dominant wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins. They were facing the Saints and Brian Hoyer. Everybody expected him to just throw to DeAndre Hopkins a ton, and what ended up actually happening was he hit Nate Washington for a couple scores. So, if you, instead of stacking Hoyer with Hopkins, you stacked them with, Nate Washington, all of a sudden you had a contrarian lineup that, was still a stack that still had that positive correlation. And then I think there's some times where you don't have to stack. And it depends on the sport. It depends on the situation. There's certain quarterbacks you don't necessarily need to stack. For example, RG3 in his rookie year, where he was just, tearing up the field with his legs, but didn't do as much in the passing game. Especially didn't have, any, wide receivers that were necessarily going off all the time. Occasionally Deshaun Jackson, but there were games RG3 put up 30 points just with his legs, 20 points and passing 10 points. So it depends on the situation. But, you can look for those plays where you don't need to stack, especially if it's like a really large slate. For example, in NBA, you don't need to necessarily stack in there if you can find the best player from every game. And that'll be a good lineup in its own right. If you can find one guy who might go off who the public isn't expecting to go off, you don't need to stack an NBA game there and hope for overtime. And, you might be sweating a lot of games trying to fade overtime in all of them, but, that's one way. If no overtimes hit, all of a sudden you've got, a lineup that doesn't have a stack that it could be contrarian, and that could actually help you vault up the field because other people are actually trying to stack looking for that overtime game.
Yeah, I think one of I don't know, what do you want to call it, the fun of DFS or the beauty of playing tournaments is that this is not only it's an evolving thing, contrarianism and finding game theory and strategy to try to win these tournaments, but it's so fast evolving. Bales mentioned that stacking was so optimal in baseball just even recently, and now so many people are doing it where it's not really optimal. The idea of stacking a quarterback with his number one wide receiver was the play in NFL. And we saw this year where there was a guy who won a Millionaire Maker stacking quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, and defense. Stacked the entire game, which is suboptimal, but, it wins. So I think that it's kind of ever evolving. And that's the fun of DFS, is that every day you can wake up and there's probably a new way to be contrarian and to win a lineup that people haven't discovered yet. So it's kind of a tough question to answer, is how to be contrarian, because in baseball this season upcoming, we're probably going to find ways to be contrarian that we haven't even thought of right now.
Yeah, I think you're trying to balance two things with stacking. One is correlations, and then the other is game theory. So the reason you stack is because players on the same team are in the same game. The production is correlated. So obviously a quarterback and receiver, batters on the same team going against the same pitcher, their play is correlated, and so you want to sort of harness that upside. Basketball is a good example where players' production isn't as correlated for the most part because they cannibalize one another's points. So you have some assist and point opportunities that can increase upside, but because NBA is a timed game, there's really only so much fantasy production to go around, and so teammates' production isn't as correlated as baseball, for example, which isn't timed and has theoretically unlimited upside. And everything that happens for a baseball player, for a batter, is good for every other player on his team. So an 8-hitter even has a single, that just increases the likelihood that the 7 guy is going to get another at-bat. Every single thing is good, whereas in basketball, a player scores and there was no assist. That's actually a bad thing for his teammates in terms of their fantasy upside. They just didn't get any points. So there's not that cannibalization, I think, is really important. And then you're trying to balance that with what other people are doing. So baseball obviously is the most correlated sport, but everyone is now stacking. So I still think stacking in most situations is optimal in tournaments. It's game theory optimal, but it depends. It depends on your competition. It depends on what they're doing. It depends on if it's multi-entry or single entry. Single entry, everyone's sort of trying to put in their best lineup, and so you're going to have a lot more lineup overlap in that than you will have in multi-entry. So there's a lot that goes into it, but fundamentally, I think it's about balancing those correlations versus the game theory.
Yep. Nick, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think, it's interesting because we talk about correlations and cannibalization, and I know there was another game this year in the NFL where the guy didn't win the Millionaire Maker, but he actually won another large GPP that wasn't the Millie Maker, and he actually won it by stacking. It was Atlanta versus Dallas. That was the game where 3 running backs went off. Devontae Freeman went off in that 40-point monster, and both Lance Dunbar and Randall went off. So, I saw people on Twitter being like, oh, yeah, I roll. The guy who, played 3 running backs from the same game had to win. And, well, why couldn't that work? There'll probably be games that are high scoring, and the running backs are the ones that benefit from it, especially if there's a couple pass catching backs, like Freeman can catch a lot of passes, and so can, Lance Dunbar, and then Joseph Randall, if he gets a couple rushing touchdowns. Why couldn't that happen? So I like to look for those situations as well that, people roll their eyes at and kind of make fun of, and actually use that to my advantage if I think that's a possible storyline that could take place with enough probability.
And I think one thing that's underrated with stacking is that you have to fill out a roster on DraftKings or FanDuel or wherever you play. So, if we're talking NFL, you have to get a quarterback and 2 wide receivers. So when you stack, let's say you stack Peyton and Demarius and Emmanuel Sanders, the probability of maybe them both going off, you're kind of banking on that game being high scoring and both going off. But what you also don't think about is that you have to fill out that second wide receiver spot with someone. So either you're taking the chance on that being a high scoring game and both of them going off, or that Demarius is going off and you're going to nail that other wide receiver 2 spot. So stacking can, in a way, kind of minimize your risk because you have to fill out the lineup. It's not like you can just take your 2 best players and that just be it. You have to fill out your whole lineup. So if you stack a whole game and it goes off, you're not only getting the upside, but you're also minimizing the risk of having to hit on all of the positions.
Yeah, the probability of every player on a team going off is small, but the probability of hitting on every player in your lineup is also small.
Probably smaller.
Yeah. So it depends on the sport, obviously, but I think that's one thing that people overlook. The chances of you winning a GPP anyway are really small. So you're just looking for what creates the biggest potential edge.
Guys, and Jonathan, let's start with you. Let's talk a little bit about actually constructing contrarian lineups. So it's one thing to talk about them, but Let's talk about the process of actually putting lineups together. What tools do you use? Like, what factors do you prioritize most?
Yeah, I would say currently creating lineups for a tournament. Again, it depends. If it's a $3 or something, it might just be pretty value driven. But for the most part, I'm a very contrarian player, and it is very much a combination of art and science right now. So the way that I start creating lineups currently for tournaments is I try to not look at anything else that anyone is saying and just come up with what I think are the best plays and best values. And I think that that's the most underrated way of being contrarian, is doing your own thing, because there's so much groupthink, and it's very difficult, even if you're aware of it, to sort of separate yourself from what other people are saying. If every outlet or beat writer or expert likes a certain player, and you didn't even like him in the beginning of the week in NFL, for example, you might find yourself gravitating toward that player, and that might be a smart idea in cash games, just because of a wisdom of the crowd sort of phenomenon. But in tournaments, I think just thinking for yourself is the best way to be contrarian. And then, I start, I guess, by thinking about just general heuristics that other people are going to use, what stands out. And, if I just look at a slate and let's say baseball, for example, and, I'm looking at implied run totals, the Vegas lines, I know everyone else is doing that. That's not unique. If something stands out to me, probably other people see it too. So I think it's really about just thinking one step ahead of your competition at all times. What are they doing? What naturally stands out to me? How is that going to sort of correlate to what other people are thinking? And then what is the best way to not only get away from that, but harness that and leverage that if they're wrong, or not even if they're wrong, but if things don't go their way. So a good example in baseball might be when a pitcher gets called up and he's min-priced, the batters opposite him almost always see really high ownership. Everyone stacks against that pitcher. Going against the grain in a smart way might be actually using that pitcher, because if he does well or even decently, all those stacks drop, and then you also rise at the same time. So that would be a good example of how you might try to leverage maybe a weakness in public psychology into an advantage. But overall, I think it's combining the data. I guess it's about knowing when to use the data, and knowing when it's okay to be value driven, versus when you should probably be maybe take more of the art approach to it.
And I just want to compliment you there on your use of the word heuristics. Very good. I think that's the first time for this show. Bryan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that my favorite way to be contrarian just naturally is what Bale said. It's just insulation, just kind of making your own decisions before you look anywhere else, whether it's models or projections or Twitter or whatever it may be. It's just coming to your own conclusions and then using the groupthink as a filter for your own lineups. But yeah, I mean, I think there are other ways, but again, like I said, it's hard because it's just ever evolving. So it's hard to find an exact way to be contrarian. I think that there's a ton of ways, millions of ways probably, if we're talking about different sports. And honestly, it really just depends on what sport we're talking about. If we're talking NBA, it's really hard to get off a really, really valuable player. So I don't necessarily think you should be contrarian in that way and fade him. So, you would have to look and try to get off other players, so that might be secondary values, but keep that guy in. In baseball, which is not really predictable from night to night, I think you can be really contrarian and really – I don't think there's maybe a rule on you have to play this player in this situation, or you have to do this. Pitchers probably, but for batters, I don't think there's really any rules about you have to use this guy or you have to do this. So I think that maybe just understanding the predictability of the sports is one of your biggest edges. Because if you understand that baseball is so unpredictable, then you're a lot more willing to take a risk into maybe either pay up or pay down, or it doesn't even matter, because you can try to figure out what the public's going to be on, and that just to predict a little bit of baseball, the chances of them going off is going to be a lot smaller than that guy going off. Any guy that's 60% owned in baseball, the chances of them going off is a lot lower than 60%, really in any situation. So in baseball, I think it makes sense to really think for your own and be contrarian in a lot of different ways. But it's hard to answer because you have to think for yourself, right?
One thing I'll say is if you're comfortable with your lineup, then I think you're probably not being very contrarian. The nature of being contrarian is being a little bit uncomfortable with what you're doing.
Yeah, let me add something there with kind of constructing contrarian lineups in NBA. I think for NBA it's really tricky in particular because so much of your lineup construction happens during that last hour, last half hour. And we talked about insulating yourself to a degree, and I definitely think that makes sense. But another way to kind of gauge the temperature of the public and figure out what everybody's kind of thinking during that last hour, half hour when all these injuries and news hit. I think a lot of guys in that period of time become buzzy, become the guy stepping into an expanded role as a new starter in the lineup. A way to be contrarian there is kind of just take the temperature of the public, kind of see where they are and kind of these buzzy, more mainstream plays that come out of this news period, and just kind of fading those guys. I think a lot of the traps that come in with the NBA is just kind of overreacting to that news that comes late. This guy might see 28, 30 minutes now, and he's 4,500. I have to play him. And I think kind of an easy way to be contrarian and fade the public is kind of take a second look at those type of guys and look elsewhere.
And I do think that there's going to be guys that are really popular. So the easy way to be contrarian that you'll see in every article is there's a really, really popular guy that everyone's going to be on. The way to be contrarian is to fade that one guy. And I think that another way to be contrarian and just kind of how you're setting your lineups, if you're a person who multi-entry their lineup, so if you put in 100 lineups and you think that this guy is going to be at 40%, then just set your exposure to him at 30%. So you're still getting exposure to him. You're still having some lineups with him in that could be unique, but you're still less than the field. Or if there's a guy who you think that is going to be better than his ownership dictates, then set your exposure to him a little bit higher than you think the field is going to be. So you don't necessarily have to – it's not as concrete as I'm going to fade this player because that may not necessarily be a great idea just to completely fade a really good value. But you could just maybe set your exposure just a little less than the field, and hopefully that works out.
That's also related to your risk tolerance. So if you do think a guy is a bad play and you want to fade him completely, that might be the most plus EV thing to do long term, but it's also going to be super volatile. So you're going to have really wild swings in your bankroll when you're continually fading all chalk players. So it really comes down to just risk tolerance on what type of player you are.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a multi-enter in NASCAR, for example, and if I see a guy I really like, I'm going to go hard on him. So it may not just be like fading a chalk play, but for me, it might be going really hard, even on a chalk play, just going harder than the public, so that I have more combinations with that guy than the public does. But like Bales mentioned earlier, I like to kind of do my own thing, figure out who I like. It doesn't matter what sport it is. And then I like to look at the Twitter noise or the ESPN noise or all of those big sites. And if they're all kind of recommending the same guy, I'm probably a little less enthused by that guy than everyone else, that's an easy fade situation for me. And again, just keeping up with that last minute news in a sport like NBA. I gave the Greg Monroe example. Everybody on Twitter was talking about, oh gosh, I'm going to have to bench him now. And I just left him in. He played 3 less minutes than his average for the year. But that, NBA being such a minute-driven sport, especially for a guy like Monroe, it was actually a plus EV move to leave him in my lineup. So risk tolerance for multi-entering, I think, is a very important part of it. If you're risk adverse and you're just kind of learning to be a contrarian, maybe you do have that 20 or 30% exposure to a 40% owned guy. But if you're really don't think he's going to have a good day, or if you like a guy a whole lot, you can go a whole lot heavier on him than the public if you have a lot of risk tolerance. So it just depends on what kind of player you are, and it didn't all come right away for me. I had to study and put in the hard work and learn a lot, but I got to the point where I was able to tolerate a little bit more risk, also because, at least in NASCAR, I believe I have a little bit more of an edge, so I can deal with that more risk. But as the game theory catches up, I'll probably, de-risk myself a little bit. So it's completely situationally dependent, but you got to find what works for you is the main thing.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and finish this one off. Any closing words of wisdom? Nick, let's start with you.
Yeah, I just mentioned it. You just have to put in hard work. You really have to kind of get ingrained in the contest, the sport that you're in. I know for me, I'm never going to play Major League Baseball just because I can't stand watching it. I can't stand following the numbers, even though I'm a numbers guy. But really dig into the slate or the sport that you love. If don't hesitate to try something new, and if you find you like it, then really get ingrained into it and just immerse yourself in everything. Go to all the different sites, check out all the different articles and podcasts, because there's a lot of good advice out there, and really immerse yourself in it. And as far as being a contrarian, start to really think about what everybody else is doing, and then figure out if there's a smart way to just be different and just kind of, be smartly different and figure out who you like and why, and make sure you have a kind of a why you like this guy or this situation, and then go with it.
Bryan, closing thoughts.
Yeah. I don't want to be the guy that says process over results, because that's probably the most cliche phrase in DFS, but I do think it's really important to understand that, just the DFS is a marketplace, really. Like, you're competing against other people, and it's a zero-sum game. So game theory and strategy are going to continually evolve. So if you come up with an idea or have some sort of thing that you think is going to work as far as being contrarian and winning a GPP, and then you are completely tied down to that heuristic, good word, yeah, then you're probably going to, even if you may profit in the short term, you're going to really hurt yourself in the long term just by being rigid in your process. So as much as I hate to say process over results, I think it really is important, especially as a tournament player, to really to be open to the fact that you're probably going to be wrong about a lot of things, and to understand your weaknesses and your biases, and to try to get around them on a daily basis.
Jonathan, closing thoughts.
I thought that point about being flexible was a good one. It's more valuable for contrarian players to just always be evolving. And then the other thing I would say is that the goal of any league is to maximize your chances of winning. It's to maximize win probability. And the way that you do that differs based on the payout structure. So in a 50-50 or a head-to-head, you might be trying to maximize points. You might be trying to maximize floor. But for the most part, you're trying to be as value-driven as possible. The way to maximize win probability in tournaments is almost never to try to maximize points. And so I think everyone goes into tournaments thinking, I need to figure out how to score as many points as possible, because to win this, I'm going to need to score a lot of points, when the goal should be maximizing that edge and maximizing win probability and figuring out how can I win scoring the fewest points possible. And I think having that mindset, just that simple idea is really, really valuable, that you're not trying to maximize points in tournaments.
Ever evolving like a virus. Justin, you've been our silent secret weapon for most of the show. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, not really. I think I'll just close by saying, I think people just kind of want to come in, hear the word contrarian, and try to be contrary, try to be different, just to be different, not really understand the reasons behind it, not really take the time to really understand their opponents, what their tendencies are, how they're making their decisions, and kind of get into their thought process and figuring out how kind of best to exploit their habits. And I think it's pretty much all about that. And I think being contrarian, it differs from contest to contest, from player pool size to player pool size. It's not a set definition. It's really just reacting to your opponents and your competition, and not really just boxing yourself in and being very rigid. It's about like it's been said, very flexible. So that's what I'd close with.
All right, guys, great show. You are my coalition of contrarians. It was fantastic information. Special thanks to Nick Giffen for being our special guest. You can follow him on Twitter at Rotodoc and catch all of his work at Rotoviz. And then thanks to Bryan, Justin, and Jonathan for being on the show and representing the FL. You can follow them on Twitter at Bryan Mears, Phan, and Bales Football. And, of course, you can find their work at FantasyLabs. And that will do it for this episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable, brought to you by FantasyLabs. I'm Matt Freedman, Matt F. the Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.